Reproductive rights and reproductive justice. I'm Carolina Mosquera Vera. I'm part of the Abortion Figurations project at the University of Warsaw when I'm doing my PhD. And I'm really grateful with Citi and with Lara and everyone to have the chance to be here, and also Libya. So we will be learning from 2 books that are going to be launched in this session, and then we will have the roundtable. So that's why we have a little bit more of time, because it's a lot of content for just one session. So I will start introducing Mindy, that is going to be presenting the first book, and then we will have some comments of the co-authors of the book, and then we have the second book and a second session of comments. So Mindy, I also wanted to say a first thing that you saw the title of the session is Reproductive Justice, right? So as you know, it's a broader framework to understand the conjunction between reproductive rights and broader struggles regarding social justice. So having these 3 principles from a framework that come from Black feminist Sister Song Collective in the USA, just to have in mind that we are talking about the right to not have a child, the right to have a child, and the right to parent your children in safe and healthy environments. So it gives us a rich perspective in what to think about in a more, kind of complicated context that goes beyond abortion. So in that case, now I will invite Mindy Roseman. She's a co-editor of Accessing Abortion, Global and Comparative Perspectives, the book that she will be presenting. And Mindy is a director of international law programs and the Grover Program for Global Justice and Women's Rights at the Yale Law School. And she's both a researcher and an advocate. And congratulations for this great book. And you have, the floor is yours. And thank you.
Automatically on? Oh yeah, great. Thank you so much for being here. I really want to thank the organizers, as always, for the Bergen Exchanges. This book, in many ways, owes its existence in part to the Bergen Exchanges. Siri and Lisa's insistence, not only on social network theory, but social network practice, is really how I came to know Neil and Satang and some other contributors to the book. Hopefully it pays it forward, and we'll see many more books and projects that come out organically from our meetings here at Global Exchanges. So when Rachel Rebouche and I proposed this project in the spring of 2022, it was shortly before the Dobbs decision came out, and the then Biden-Harris administration was promoting something called codifying Roe. And we're both academics and human rights attorneys, among other things, and we've dedicated a lot of our lives to studying comparative international abortion law. And we reached out to each other and we were like, well, what would that mean to codify Roe? What do statutory abortion rights accomplish that judicializing abortion rights don't? And what are the consequences foreseen and unforeseen of doing that? And we thought, oh, this is a great time to, take stock. And we knew that answers could be found through both historical or, self-reflexive, a look at the United States, and also comparatively to other countries and case studies. So in the US, thinking about abortion rights as statutory entitlements is both new and very old. But in the 1990s, at least at the federal level, the Democrats had majorities in both the houses, and they were considering something called the Freedom of Choice Act. It ultimately failed over issues such as minors' access to abortion without parental notification, and some other issues like state funding for abortions. So right now, obviously there's some momentum to get a federal law to restore access to abortion. It's something that's mobilizing a lot of people, but at the same time, there's great fear as what kind of federal action will be taken with, the majority in Congress being Republican to restrict access to abortion even further. So it's kind of a dead letter on the federal level. When we look at case studies across the country, we find that permissive laws can be very instructive. Some of the chapters in the book, which Satang can speak to, and as well as Neil, show how permissive laws work and function, and comparing them, spotlights not only the content of the laws, but the importance of social mobilization, and especially issues that are much broader than simply access to abortion. What the objective, one of the objectives of this book was to make visible the costs and benefits of legislating and or judicializing rights, especially in politically divided environments. The US certainly qualifies as such, especially in the aftermath of Roe versus Wade and the patchwork of policies left in its aftermath. In thinking about this book post-Dobbs, we really wanted, and we asked the contributors to the volume, maybe we could change it to the table of contents. Is that possible? Or is that slide up there already? I can't see. Okay, thank you. We asked the contributors to think about the impact of Dobbs. And Dobbs has both had a positive and a negative effect, and maybe we can speak to that later, and you all have something to say on that there. So despite Dobbs, and one of the takeaways from the book and from many other books, and Satang's edited collection, I'm sure, shows this as well, is how increasingly there has been a liberalization in access to abortion globally, despite punctuated and very dramatic moments in the United States, in Poland, and other places, as well as in this context of growing anti-gender and anti-rights movements and restrictions, both institutionally and as a matter of social and political movements. So while there have been amazing gains, such as General Comment 36 by the Human Rights Committee of the UN on accessing abortion, many calls for decriminalization across the UN system, as well as the World Health Organization's guidance on safe abortion for the first time. What we know is that legality alone does not ensure access. It can enable access, and law does provide an important expressive function. It sends a powerful message, and it is grounds for hope. And what I tell my students when I teach is, I'm in the business of hope mongering. So what law can give us reference to, even though there are moments where it does seem to be, and by law I'm referencing the entire, let's just say that continuum that Jeff put up on the board this morning of possible entry points. No matter where we are at one place, eventually we know that things change. And things change because people act. And so that is the overall takeaway message of my life and the book. And I do want to just, before I turn it over, really give special thanks both to Satang and Neil, who contributed chapters, as to all of the contributors. They did it out of a labor of love. And we're intensely grateful. There are a number of chapters in the book. Let me just speak briefly about the process of this. So when we gathered, it was having convinced some students involved in the Harvard Human Rights Journal to hold a symposium. And we thought we could get the free labor of students to turn it into a special issue. But then Dobbs hit and kind of upended the entire process. And then students graduated, and the next draft of editors weren't terribly interested in taking on the agenda of the former editorial board. So Rachel and I pivoted. We held a series of meetings, one at the UN, some at Law and Society Association meetings, and NYU Press agreed to publish the book. It's in two general parts. The first one looks sort of regionally and comparatively at legal developments and the actors, both that were advocating for greater access and those who really got mobilized towards restricting access. And Neil and Satang's chapters both fit in there. And also Mariana, who's not here, wrote an amazing chapter about Latin America and sort of the self-help and self-managed abortion movements. And in the second half of the book looks more in depth at individual case studies. And I think one of the most remarkable things, other than the general trend towards increasing access, is also the empowerment of people who are seeking to control their reproductive lives and how they have been able to work despite the law, in the shadow of the law, against the law, or above the law. And I do find the case of Canada quite instructive as a kind of an anti-example, and one that's inspirational. So when the book comes out, I always say it will be a great stocking stuffer for those who celebrate the season of gift giving around a fireplace. But we may be a little delayed in publication. So I've taken up way too much time over, and thank you very much.
Congrats. I know this has been a long time coming, and I appreciate the opportunity to contribute a chapter, and good morning, everybody. I'll just take about 4 or 5 minutes since I also have time to talk later, so to give time to Neil as well. But I just wanted to give a quick insight in relation to the chapter that I contributed, which was titled Post-Ops, Insights from African Abortion Laws and Practice. It's obviously, as I said, broad strokes in relation to what's happening in the African continent. But as Mindy rightly said, I mean, the increasing trend that we see globally obviously is very much reflected in the African region. And this is also very central, given the fact that the African region has the first, what we say, the International Human Rights Instrument that explicitly recognizes the right to safe abortion. So in the Maputo Protocol, and during the time of writing, we celebrated 20 years. And currently we have more than 44 African countries which have signed and ratified the Maputo Protocol. So I think what I wanted to do with the chapter was really to say that Africa and African perspectives doesn't really need to exist on the margins, but that we're very central in terms of the global debate around sexual and reproductive health and rights, but particularly around abortion. And I think it's interesting as well, even as we think about the increasing trends as well, and that usually it's not the central conversation, but Francophone Africa, for instance, we've seen very great progress. So countries like Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, as well as other countries have increasingly ratified the Maputo Protocol, and given their legal system, has automatically then liberalized the abortion grounds as well. And very recently, even in the Gambian context with the new criminal code, the abortion grounds have been expanded to reflect what we see in the Maputo Protocol. I think this is all great, and I think part of what we also had to offer, especially during at the time of the symposium, and that was when the edition was leaked before the final one, was that we also had very increasingly progressive jurisprudence that were coming out from the region as well, particularly in Kenya, where we saw a case that explicitly recognized medical necessity in relation to abortion, particularly for minors as well. But I think what I also try to portray in the chapter as well is to say that countries like South Africa, and I had the privilege of engaging with the PhD students in relation to my own work, especially around consensus objection, is to say even with those liberal abortion regimes, that obviously we do have challenges as it relates to that, particularly as it relates to barriers, but also I'm sure Neil will talk a little bit about the counter-mobilization that we've seen, particularly given the sort of linkages of anti-abortion, anti-rights, conservative actors that are linked to right-wing organizations and activists, both in the US, but also in Europe and other places as well. So really seeing the transmission of ideas and strategies, particularly around court cases, court-centered strategies that we've seen in the US that we've also seen in South Africa with the fetal burial case as well as others. So I think, just to conclude, just to say, I think, as we obviously think about postdoc, I think what is really central is that there are nuanced differences between obviously the African region and what we see in the US, particularly in terms of using gender equality as a juridical basis, and that perhaps the US, obviously not perhaps, but the US obviously has a lot to learn from other regions, and so greatly appreciate the opportunity to offer my very small insights from the African region. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So I wrote the chapter on Europe, and maybe I'll start by explaining a little bit how I got involved in this. So Mindy had contacted me. I was wavering a little bit, then the Dobbs thing happened, and within 2 weeks of the Dobbs decision happening in the United States, there was an event in the European Parliament entitled basically trying to look at how we can bring the good news of the United States overturning abortion rights to Europe. And this was organized by a Spanish member of the far-right Vox political party with the European representative of a US Christian right organization. So I thought, okay, let's take a look at what this Dobbs thing means for Europe, okay? And I sort of knew that you can't apply the same strategies that you had in the US to Europe because the situations are different. So how are they different? In the US, you had a decision from the US Supreme Court, and then the states were bound by this, although the states could do different things. In Europe, we have no such decision from the European Court of Human Rights. And in fact, as was pointed out yesterday, since there's no consensus on this area, it is reticent to get involved in this. And then at the EU level, this is not a prerogative of the European Union to get involved. It's the sole competence of the member states. So what are the opportunities for the different anti-abortion, anti-gender actors to move in the same direction as they have in the US? So I took a look at what they have been doing, and I was able to see that there's maybe two phases in how it is that they organized against abortion rights. In the past, what they used to do was three different things. One was a direct confrontation of abortion rights. So we have this characterized in Spain. There was a big Aborto Zero campaign. You have initiatives in different countries, such as Switzerland, to defund abortion from the medical insurance. You have direct assaults on abortion rights. Next, you have a whole phase of activity in the 2010s, 2014, something like that, where they challenged the consensus model of European abortion laws. If you remember, European abortion laws, they come out of the late 60s, early 70s, and they're based on a consensus model. We allow abortion, but it's restricted. It's not like it is in the US up until whatever. It's much more limited in terms of gestational limits, and we make women go through a few hurdles, counseling and things like that, but it's basically available, okay? And this was to establish a consensus at the time. We see that there were attempts to upset that consensus by launching citizens' initiatives, usually petitions, asking the government to reverse or revise the abortion laws in different areas. So we see this in Finland, in Poland, in Portugal, in different places. There was even a European citizens initiative called One of Us, asking for defunding of EU funding for anything involving the destruction of human life. So we see that happening. None of these really worked, okay? And then we also have the third route, litigation, and specifically by the US Christian right groups established in Europe, trying to bring cases before the European courts. One famous example brought by ADF, Alliance Defending Freedom, involved a Swedish midwife who said she couldn't get a job because she was Christian and as a midwife, etc., etc. It went all the way up to the European Court of Human Rights, did not work. So you have these three attempts which didn't work. In 2017, we were able to see that the anti-gender movement had changed tack, had changed approach for how they wanted to challenge abortion rights. They adopted a threefold approach, which could be adapted to almost any context. That threefold approach was prevent, restrict, prohibit. By prevent, they don't mean increasing access to voluntary contraception. What they mean by prevent is stopping a woman from accessing her legal right to an abortion through crisis pregnancy centers, disinformation hotlines, and things like that. Then restrict, restrict is counseling or, different restrictions, and prevent is what you have in Poland and Malta, etc. So we see that this was their approach, okay? And they were successful in running with this in a number of different countries, even unexpected countries such as the Netherlands, which the Netherlands was providing state funding to a whole network of anti-abortion crisis pregnancy centers for almost a decade, up until there started to be parliamentary scrutiny about this. Now, what have the progressives been doing in this time? I would say that there have been a number of different catalysts that have propelled progressive activism on improving abortion laws to make them more progressive. I would say that the first one was the Irish referendum, which liberated Ireland into having a more modern abortion law. It's not a great one, but it's a more modern one. Okay. This led about to a whole series of legislative events and reforming abortion laws in lots of tiny little places. We need to remember that the the 1967 UK Abortion Act covered England, Wales, and Scotland, but not Northern Ireland, and not all of these little dependencies of the UK, Jersey, the Channel Islands, Isle of Man, Gibraltar, and you see a flurry of legislative activity across all of these little dependencies changing abortion laws, including in Ulster, which was eventually done by the UK Parliament. Another catalyst was Poland, 2020, when the Constitutional Tribunal basically made abortion virtually illegal in almost all circumstances. This led the mainstream public opinion to consider that accommodating conservative religious forces was not so much about that anymore, but that restricting abortion was a democratic backsliding in and of itself. You have the WHO guidelines, and then you have Dobbs, which I think sent a shockwave through many mainstream politicians in Europe, thinking that Poland was first, okay, but Poland is conservative, Catholic, Eastern Europe, not fully realized as a democracy. We can understand that. The US, that's another thing, okay? And if it can happen there, it can happen anywhere. So I'll end, okay, very quickly. Okay, so that was one of the main catalysts. So so where are we at now with these different trends happening? We've seen that there's been a flurry of progressive advances in abortion laws across Europe. They're small. They don't necessarily make it into the headlines, except national headlines. Norway is one, Denmark is one, another one. One that did make it internationally is France, which put abortion into the French constitution, which I think is a very French thing to do, because they were the most glamorous thing to do, which actually had zero impact on women. Okay, so that whether it's in the constitution or not, same right as before, but they get all the credit for having done the most grandiose thing. Where are the risks still, where do the risks remain? One is that litigation has proven to be a valid strategy for the anti-gender. Okay, so they are investing in more of that. If you got the results from Dobbs in the United States, you spend more time doing this in other countries, and you hope you'll get the same thing. Another risk is that of the far-right political parties. Now something I mentioned yesterday, but the far-right political parties do have this as part of their agenda, and they do have capturing the courts and other public institutions to meet their interests. And so we could have that type of accident happen as well. And then finally, there is a wave of progressive movement, and I'll just end here. There is a call to include the right to abortion in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, which has been adopted by the European Parliament, which could go forward if the treaties are reopened. So there is a positive possibility on the horizon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neil. Okay. And now we will move to our second book that we are launching today. And one of the editors is Satang. The book is titled Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights in Sub-Saharan Africa. Many congrats for launching this book, and also for moving from the margins to the center in African feminist theory regarding abortion. So yeah, the floor is yours. You have 10 minutes.
Sure. Thank you. I get to speak again. Many thanks for the opportunity to give a prelude, and the book will be forthcoming with Emerald Publishing. It has a long title, is Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights in Sub-Saharan Africa, the role of digital innovation and emerging technologies, or digital innovation at SRHR in Africa, however you want to call it. But I also wanted to just take a second, because I mean, as I mentioned yesterday, the Bergen is home, but it is also coincident that I do have family, and I do want to recognize my uncle who came, Uncle Ba, as well as my cousin. They are in the room, so which is great. This is like my 9th time, and they are here, so Siri will be happy. But yes, okay. So the The book is edited by myself and Ebenezer. There's no reason for these pictures, but because I did a photo shoot and the picture looks really nice. So I decided I wanted to include it there, but it's also taken by Dr. David Ikpo, lawyer and multimedia extraordinaire, who has been great at doing, yes, and he has been here as well, who has been great in doing all of these book covers. And this is not just a plug, it's open access. All of the books are open access. And the flyers are on the table. But I also wanted to just re-echo that the digital innovation book is not, it's not siloed in a sense. That is part of a broader and very intentional scholarship imagined from within the African continent, particularly, as I said, related to contribution towards the global debate. So from my own book, my own monograph, Choice and Conscience, to the conversation around female genital mutilation, to abortion law in Africa, co-edited with my co-editors, including the late Charles Nguena, who's also been here before as well. But I think I just wanted to just quickly set context to say, I think from the African continent, and we were very particular in the cover to say Sub-Saharan Africa because North Africa wasn't part of it. So that's why the title is also a little bit longer as well. But we were particularly interested, given the explosion of emerging technologies and the conversations around digital innovation, what does it mean within the African context, particularly looking at both risk and opportunities as well. And so this book actually emerges from a colloquium that we organized back in 2023. So it's a 2-year book project, but very much inspired by a report by the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health, Dr. Taleng Mofenke, on the same issue, right, where obviously she took broad strokes looking at the context globally. But as I said, I think which is very similar to the African context, but also in the global conversation around as well in relation to the opportunities, particularly as we think around telemedicine, also given the sort of fast pace that we see due to COVID-19, as well as the issue around trying to address especially provider shortage as well as other issues. But I think as we also think about risk factors, obviously the issue around data privacy comes in, the issue around equity access, particularly to the internet, especially when we're thinking about the African context and what that looks like, data protection, but also with the big tech companies and the data mining that continues to happen within the African context, but also in the global south as well, and thinking those as risk, but particularly as well as we think about the normative framework and the gaps that are there in relation to the protection as well. And so it sort of informs both the approach and the objectives as well. So it was very interdisciplinary in terms of having folks, both scholars as well as practitioners from different fields, from law to tech, as well as in other areas, but very much obviously grounded through the human rights lens, obviously acknowledging the coloniality of human rights, and particularly in the spaces that we're in as well. So as I indicated, we were very much interested in exploring the existing legal frameworks, but the gaps as well, and particularly the ethical implications of what does it mean to engage and utilize this, especially given, as I said, the increasing trend, obviously, towards more liberal laws that govern sexual and reproductive health and rights, but obviously within the US context as well as others, including the African context that is also learning from those spaces, increasing calls for criminalization as well, especially given the sort of privacy concerns now, especially with the pregnancy apps as well as the others as well. And so we approached it in 4 ways. So we have 4 sections. In the book, the first section talks about conceptual principles. Particularly there, we talked about assisted reproductive technologies, but also the issue around surrogacy as well. We did have country case studies, so countries from Zambia to Zimbabwe to South Africa to Nigeria, as well as other contexts. And then we were particularly interested in relation to adolescent, youth, and digital interventions as well, especially given that the use of social media as well as other platforms obviously obviously are very much familiar and popular with young people and what that looks like within that context. And so even for that particular section, we did have a practitioner as well. And then we did look at human rights and sub-regional bodies. And this is, I wouldn't go in depth into the table of content, but this just gives you a broad framework of the various areas. We were also very honored to have Dr. T do the foreword, and really in terms of centering the report that she did in 2023, but also the importance of the book, particularly to provide nuanced insights within the African context as we think about digital innovations and emerging technologies as well. And we did have early praises, both from Alan as well as Patty as well, and the book has a website. It's gonna come out later this year. But yes, but again, to say many thanks. This is my second opportunity to launch a book during the Bergen Exchanges. So looking forward to the insights of my fellow panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Satang. And we are going to start with the comments on these two books. So I will introduce the experts that will be going to be commenting and reflecting on this work. So we have Carmelisa Rosario. She's there. She's a social anthropologist. She got her PhD here from the University of Bergen, and she's currently a lecturer and researcher at the Center for International Health here at the University of Bergen. And then we'll have Karolina Kosemba. She's next to me. She's a social legal scholar and a Mary Zlotowska, because he was Polish, Curie postdoctoral fellow at the Erasmus University of Rotterdam. And we have Irene Maffei, using blue. And she's a professor of social anthropology at the Institute of Social Sciences at the University of Lucerne. So we have social legal perspectives, but also social anthropologists' expertises. So you can go first, Carmelisa.
Thank you. This is another hat, from yesterday. It happens here at the Bergen Exchanges a lot. Well, congratulations all on your books, and I think they are amazing contributions. I will focus more on the Sub-Saharan digital, I don't remember the title, it's very long. Although there is this nagging question that I have in relation to access to abortion with the UK, because before the Irish law changed, the UK was the safe haven, and suddenly there is criminalization of women doing self-prescribed. So it's the first time I read that news, I was like, okay, the world is a little bit upside down. So I think your book is really, it's timely and fascinating. I looked at the table of contents, and I think it will be a small Bible for me. So thank you. And Satang, so I'm not going to do like a deep dive and comment on everything, but I'm going to sort of look at what it sort of made me think about. And so there is this legal engagement, and I'm thinking of the sociological, historical aspects of it, and the discussions that I have been engaging in for some years. And so one is there's this connection, and rightfully so, between the digital and youth. And I thought about a friend of mine, Pauline Lemaire, who did work on the digital, but in the political space, and how actually it's not the youth that engages the most, and that actually there is a space beyond youth on how there is this engagement. And I thought about Mbembe, who said that sort of the internet is Afropolitan, and it has to do with how Africans have these far-reaching networks, family networks. They're very mobile, they're everywhere. Well, case in point. Just, not just because of war or poverty, but, this is how we roll. And so the internet has created opportunities to sort of recreate not expand, because the networks are expanded, but the communication has become more efficient. So it's sort of a natural transition to sort of take in this kind of technology, internet, and the way and the opportunities that there are to expand the mobile access in the continent, and how mobile banking has been happening. It's sort of a natural space for things to happen, and of course COVID kind of brought it in. And so I was sort of curious, as you know, as a next step, you know, beyond youth, how is the digital happening, and whether you had conversations or thoughts or even access to such information beyond youth. And especially because, you know, now we are having conversations of menopause and all these things, and so many things are happening in the more affluent and middle class environments and conversations and the use of the internet. And I was really happy that you were also tapping into issues of surrogacy and the issues of infertility, because, you know, you have this sort of culturally are aspects that are important. And then I thought, okay, the issues of infertility are happening also with another technology, which is, for example, the implants. And, you know, Bill Gates is now around a new controversy, because now it will be from 5 years to 8 years. And already the 5 years prevention is creating a lack of willingness for women to take them, because 5 years is too long and it's considered like infertility, right? From the perspective. So for me, it was sort of like the cultural engagements. There was one chapter where I saw that connection is there, and I think it was around surrogacy and assisted pregnancy, so, or the technology. So that was also very interesting to, you know, what were your sort of connections to the cultural aspects beyond sort of the law. And the last point, and you did talk about sort of the data mining, and I'm so happy that you're thinking about this, but I'm also thinking about the environmentalists and the feminists in the continent who are talking about not only, but you know, sort of the harvesting of cheap labor, the environmental effects of AI, you thought AI, and other types of extraction that is not just data. So, yeah. So already without reading, I'm like, oh my God.
Thank you very much. Now we will continue in that order, so we can go with it. And you can start thinking your questions, because after Carolina, you can start doing, you know, the Q&A. So have your questions in mind. And yeah, the floor is yours, Irene.
So hello everyone, and congratulations to Mindy and Satang. I'm here because I have worked on abortion in Tunisia after the revolution of 2011, and I also contributed a chapter to another book that Satang has edited with other colleagues. And I also, with Liv Donnison, who is here, we also edited a special section of health and human rights on abortion in the Middle East, and a chapter in another book by Merit Ziegler, which is abortion, research handbook of international abortion law, and it was a chapter on abortion in the Arab countries. So my expertise is not on Sub-Saharan Africa or other or European region, but more on North Africa, as I am a specialist of the Arab world. And I had some general comments I wanted to make, not going to specifically in each book probably. One of the comment I have, and I think about the case of Tunisia, is that what we see now is that in many countries where authoritarian regimes or kind of authoritarian regimes are back, we see a restriction of abortion rights. And in Tunisia, I saw exactly the opposite, because during the Ben Ali regime, so until 2011, the access to abortion was granted by the regime, actually, and several rights, women's rights, were also granted by the regime. But after the elections of Ennahda, so an Islamist party, in October 2011, and so during the period I was there, now the situation completely changed. But there was a trend to question several women's rights. Among these rights was abortion access, so the right to abortion. So during a democratization process, there was a much conservative ideology which spread in the country, and which actually threatened the right of women to get abortion care. So at this time, it was between 2013 and 2014, I was working in public, government clinics offering abortion care, and in a few hospitals that were still offering abortion care. And although the law had not been changed at the time, most women were turned, so couldn't access abortion care because healthcare providers didn't offer abortion care simply, or the hospital had decided that it was not, something they wanted to offer anymore. Although, legally, it was nothing but had changed. And also many providers were afraid of still offering abortion care because of the government, and several also movements, extremist movements that were attacking clinics in the country, so at the time. So I think it's interesting how in a democratization process, it was quite effervescent at the time I was there. Women had lost rights in the domain of sexual and reproductive care, and also, and I will not talk about this, in the domain of contraception. So this is quite interesting. And I also have another remark to make about what the colonial rule brought about in colonized countries. I'm speaking about Arab countries, for example, but I'm sure it's also a discourse that can be applied to other countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, is that European colonizers came and pretended to, they wanted to, they said they were modern, they wanted to bring modernity, they wanted to bring progress, they wanted to bring development to colonized countries, but actually they brought about very conservative regimes, for example, in the domain of reproductive health. So as it was already cited, in many countries there existed no ban to abortion officially, and it was widely practiced, for example, in North Africa, although it was not, there was no law regulating actually locally abortion, but it was practiced, and it was practiced since the Middle Ages. There were even some treaties, medical treaties, explaining in the Arab medical tradition how not to have children or even to get abortion care. And there were traditional midwives practicing this. And I think it's true for many other countries. And the laws banning abortion were European laws. And so this, of course, was inherited by post-colonial states. And in most, for example, Arab majority countries, abortion on demand, abortion for social reasons, is still today prohibited. And Tunisia is an exception because for actually demographic reasons, and the idea that to have a socio-economic development, you have to reduce the natality rate. In 1965, it was first allowed for women who had at least 5 children to get abortion care, and since 1973 it was for all categories of women, including unmarried women, which is quite exceptional in the region. So I think it's interesting to reflect also on what is modernity, what is tradition, and the way, so still today, I think European countries or countries from the global north, let's say, see and consider practices in previous colonized countries. And I'm so happy that you published also this book and showing how pioneering and how modern, let's say, are, for example, Sub-Saharan African countries, but not only Sub-Saharan African countries, because always we have this idea that they are not developed enough, they need development. And this is the language which is still used in much of the development industry, and even in you know, these national aid agencies, for example, in Switzerland. And I also have maybe a remark about religion and the use of religion, because many times we think religion is used to justify the reduction of women's rights in the domain of abortion, for example, and this is true. But for example, in Tunisia, Habib Bourguiba, who was the first president of Tunisia, justified the liberalization and decriminalization of abortion through Islam. And also contraception in many countries, the adoption of medical contraception of the Arab world was justified through religion, so through Islam. So I think it's interesting to maybe reverse the idea we can have about Islam as being very conservative, and Christianity as was the case in the colonial period, as the religion bringing modernity and bringing development in backward societies. I mean, this was the idea. And maybe, if I have still time, last observation about the new technologies. I mean, for example, social media, but also the fact that now it's possible, for example, to access misoprostol, so these medications which are very cheap, through, for example, some networks that offer, and of course you have to have access to the internet, and then use self-administered abortion care. And this is the case in many African countries, including in North Africa. And this access to technologies, it's in a way bypassing the control of the state that was actually delegated through healthcare providers. So healthcare providers were kind of gatekeepers, not only in Africa, but also in many other in European countries, giving access or not to abortion care, for example. Now, through technologies, you can skip this control, because you can access, for example, misoprostol or other, even assisted reproductive technologies without going through state medical system. So I think it's quite interesting how the access to technologies is allowing women to get access to medical technology they didn't have access to, because healthcare providers were exerting a kind of control. They were not only moral entrepreneurs, but they were really not allowing physically the access for example, abortion care. So that what I saw in Tunisia at the time I was doing this, I was conducting this research, where even if the law allowed women to access abortion care, they were refused abortion care in the clinics. So they didn't have other way to do. Okay, so I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Irene. And last but not least, we have Carolina Cosemba that was going to bring us a really interesting perspective and also like complementary about right-wing mobilization, right? That we should be knowing more about. So thank you for researching that, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carolina. And first of all, congratulations to all the authors. I think both books are really needed. And after reading introduction and table of contents of Mindy and Rachel book, I'm the person who would like to receive the gift near the Christmas time. So, yeah, take a note. And I will comment only one book. I will refer to your book because I have only 5 minutes. So I decided, and I'm researching right-wing legal mobilization that was mentioned in your book. That is why I will focus only on one. So as editors note in introduction, and Mindy already mentioned it, there is a global tendency towards expanding abortion rights. Yet, in my brief intervention, I want to focus on the other side of the picture, on restrictions. And this seems particularly relevant because this conference, one of the main topics is autocratization. So I think it's good to talk more about it. And we were shocked in some countries, like in the US, in Poland, when the restrictions happened after 50 and 30 years. And Neil said that Poland is a Catholic country, and of course it's not the same with the US, but it's even too restrictive for a Catholic country, and the mass protests occurred, and they appeared in almost every city in Poland despite the pandemics. Like even small 10,000 people were processing there. So it was done without any social support, not that restrictive. So yeah, and I think the Populist Party lost support because of this decision. So now it's very often discussed. So first, it is important to underline that these restrictions are not the effect of government politics or a constitutional court. It was highlighted in earlier panels as well, that the changes are often driven by non-state actors, but right-wing coalitions, but right-wing organizations, and they become increasingly skilled in legal mobilizations. They strategically adopt the tools that were associated with human rights defenders, with pro-choice advocates. They are using language of rights, cherry-picking international law, and they are cooperating internationally, transnationally with other NGOs, and Neil probably wrote about it in his chapter about these cooperations. And my own research showed that in Poland, for example, limitations on abortion were advanced not any social persuasion, but through carefully tailored legal strategies, often backed by international networks. For example, in the case before Constitutional Court, American NGO was involved, Center for Law and Justice. They wrote Amici Curiae. So they were trying to influence national lawmaking process. And the activists, they were active earlier, and after Roe, that was mentioned in the book, they started to mobilize, but the strategies were different. So looking at these actors, we don't see them with rosary in the hand, very emotional, screaming. No, but these are rather professional lawyers in suits, using legal arguments and seeming very professional. And after the years of pro-choice legal mobilizations, very strategic litigations, they've learned how to do it. They're mimicking their strategies, and it's very hard to recognize, okay, maybe we know their ideology, but it's hard to distinguish them. They are doing the same. And second thing, these actors were not new, but the effectiveness grew when political opportunity structures shifted. For example, constitutional courts were started to be packed with loyal judges, as in Poland, but also in the US, the composition of Supreme Court has changed. So they were prepared, Neil already said it, they were active for many, many years and they were preparing the ground, but later the opportunity appeared and they actually waited for the moment and they were super effective then. Also, they are using soft law. Someone mentioned the case of Italy. For example, conscientious objection. So officially, you have right to abortion in Italy, but in the practice, it's limited. And it's not widely commented in publicly because it's a soft law. It's not that visible as constitutional cases. So to conclude, authors ask a crucial question in the introduction. Why is abortion polarizing in some contexts, not in others? So again, mentioning Poland. Abortion was legalized in 1956 and remained broadly uncontested for decades. And it was even a time when Swedish people traveled to Poland to have abortion services. And totally, it became totally different situation and contested topic. So this case shows us how quickly reproductive rights can be referred and weaponized in times of democratic backsliding or any other crisis. So France's recent decision to constitutionalize abortion can be seen as response to the very turbulent reality. We see the war in Europe going on in Ukraine, we see migration crisis, we see climate crisis, growth of populist parties and autocrats. So maybe it's a response to the reality. And citing Simone de Beauvoir, she said that never forget that a political, economic, or religious crisis will be enough to cast doubt on women's rights. These rights will never be vested. You'll have to stay vigilant your whole life. And France did it, actually. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolina, for keeping the time and for your insights. And now I will just start with a question, but I'll invite you to start queuing. I know there are many Latin American experts on reproductive justice, so I think that perspective would also add a lot to this conversation. And thank you, Larissa. And I have just a first question to start, but I will just add my question to the rest of them, so you can respond afterwards. My first question is regarding the concept of reproductive justice, right? That, as you were mentioning, goes beyond abortion. And since I'm from Colombia, but I'm based in Poland right now, I also have this kind of, hybrid perspective and the limits of mass mobilization, for instance, in Poland, right? But also the strength of the movement, even in these moments. But seeing that Colombia decriminalized abortion up to week 24, and we are still a very conservative country, what kind of strategies are also working? But my question is about how can we go beyond the agenda of abortion in those movements, right? Thinking about like climate degradation, economic precarity, migration policies, how can this persuade people and prevent people who are even imagining on the possibility of having children, right? I'm gonna be 30 this year, and many of my conversations are with friends that would like to be mothers, but they can't afford being mothers in this world, right? So I don't know if these agendas could be also bit together, because there is this increase in precarity, attacks on gender equality. But for instance, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights recently recognized care as a right, right? So I don't know if there we could have like a joint agenda to advance the abortion conversation and how you see that happening at the level of ground movements. So that's the first question to start, and then we continue with the rest of them. I wanted to add just a question. I thought there would be more questions, but it's about the global gag rule, and given the the progress at the global level, accepting by USA, how can we protect those that progress in this specific context of the funding and this kind of backlash and attacking the gender equality agenda, especially I think in Latin America, but also in African countries, right? Some progress has been done. How we protect that from the funding and the current policies. So yeah, now we can take this way, right? Yeah. So Carolina, and then
okay, thank you for very interesting comments. So I will answer jointly. So I will start from distinction between right-wing organizations and human rights, women's rights defenders. What are the differences? I think I should start from it. First of all is financing. And I recommend now Neil's reports on financing right-wing organizations. They're really good. So contact Neil, probably he can send it, or you will see on the website. The reports, I conducted interviews with women's rights advocates, and they said they don't have the same resources. You cannot even compare them. They have few lawyers who are trying to do a change, but they are unfinanced, so they cannot choose everything. They are looking what is possible and what is the cheapest, and if they have enough lawyers to do any cases. So I can give you an example of Poland. What are the strategies of resistance? So first of all, they are not using constitutional courts, for example, because it's packed by populists. So they say, we will not waste our resources. They were in the European Court of Human Rights. Decision was that Poland violated Article 8, but nothing actually changed in the reality. What they've done, they decided to change the interpretation of existing law. It's very restrictive right now. So abortion is allowed in the case of crime, plus threat to a woman's life and health. So they started to interpret what is the health. And they said, health is also mental health. So they conducted some cases first before a patient ombudsman, national patient ombudsman, and later they enforced the guidelines signed by a populist minister of health, actually. The guidelines for the doctors to actually to have even prescription from psychiatrists that you can have an abortion because your mental health is endangered. So what they've done, it was just reinterpretation of existing law, soft law, so guidelines, and somehow it's a way they are helping women. It's not a lot, it's symbolically not important because it's not the same what Constitution of France, for example. It's not the same what the judgment of Constitutional Court, but it's an option for women that they need help. Someone asked about strategic use of religion and Christianity, so also I can give you the example of Poland, how they use it. It's not even about religion itself, it's about the position of a Catholic Church as an organization. Probably you said at the conference, I've heard it, about empowering women and the acts created by UN and WHO in the 1990s. So I'm drafting an article right now. It will be published soon about it. So Catholic Church generalizing started to feel marginalized in a public sphere. They had to find something to be visible. And the issues were like gender generally, and under the gender was also abortion. So they were using it rhetorically to gain visibility in a public sphere. What happened in the national context in Poland? Catholic Church was in an alliance, is still in alliance with right-wing parties. And they supported in political campaigns, they mobilized voters through their media, Catholic media, and actually they had to pay the debt, kind of. And the debt was abortion. That's why probably abortion was limited, because it was the wish of Catholic Church to do something with the issue, to show that their issues are, that their discourse is more visible and it's more powerful. I will finish because I don't have time yet.
Okay, thanks. So many questions are really evocative. I just wanted to make a comment, and hopefully it will start to answer the questions, and it's really directed towards Carmelisa, just about what the story of abortion liberalization, en gros, has meant, which has been to look at where abortion was regulated or not, and often it was through the criminal law. So a lot of the early actions were to legalize and decriminalize abortion. And where abortions were permitted within the criminal law, that is to say, the person seeking the abortion would be pardoned from the consequences of their transgression of the law, often with a religious background in mind, were very limited. And why were they allowed? The criminal law as a tool is about establishing a certain idea of a political and social order, right? And what is happening right now, and in the UK, the abortion law is still in the criminal law. So whether it's connected to Ireland's liberalization or not is really an empirical and historical interpretive question. But in many places, there still is the residue of the criminal law and the attempt to reestablish a certain social and political order through the criminal law. What arguments have those invested, mostly feminists, but coalitions of actors in decriminalizing or legitimizing access to abortion? There's been the public health argument globally and, locally. And that starts from harm reduction, but it can speak more globally about health matters. It includes adolescent health. It has often been a very powerful argument. There's been the human rights arguments, which sound in a different register and have been most open, although the public health arguments too, to contestation, to counter mobilization. I don't think it's the misuse, perhaps, of legal and human rights venues to counter a human rights claim to access to abortion, that it's fair. It's a game, right? It's a fair play. It's whether or not they're legitimately playing by the rules is a different issue. And finally, there have been justice claims. And justice seemed to be the more potent category. It certainly allows people to do what they must do, despite the law, despite what the other institutions are telling them. So it's been very mobilizing, at least among vulnerable and marginalized populations in the US. I don't think it translates necessarily well to other country or regional contexts, but that's something to talk about. I think that the turn towards autonomy is yet another utopian quest for the right word and the right concept that somehow is going to finally unlock what really is a struggle about power and the place of people whose gender, sexuality, and reproductive practices are non-normative. At whatever moment that is. I'm just gonna digress and take a brief moment. I was involved with a UNFPA report on bodily autonomy. The UNFPA thought this would be a great way to bring in all the issues, whether it's about forced and child marriage, all the way up to abortion, and new reproductive technologies and access. They thought it would be a great umbrella. And yet there was an enormous amount of resistance by certain country officers and others to say the concept of autonomy simply does not travel well. So I think every time we see like a bright light, there's a cloud on the horizon, or vice versa. Over.
Thank you. In terms of the questions that were raised, I'll go through some of the ones that I think I can answer to. In terms of the possibility of including abortion into the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, I think one that depends on whether the treaties are reopened, which I think will happen in the next couple of years, and then finding some sort of consensus about including it into the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, and then whatever the agreements are with EEA would apply there. I think the European Parliament has already adopted a position in favor of that, and it's different from giving the EU competence in the issue of abortion. Okay, so I think that could be done. Next, in terms of whether the communities of counter-mobilization, how do they strategize, etc. One is that, yes, the communities that are working against the right to abortion, against many other rights, do meet, and they do discuss the issue of abortion. But what I've noticed is that they don't address the issue of abortion directly. They frame it in a positive way so that they discuss how can we boost demographic growth. Okay, but who do they invite about boosting demographic growth, one of the leaders of the main anti-abortion federation in Europe, okay, or a hate group from the United States against LGBT rights. So if your idea of boosting demographic growth is limiting abortion and that the gays are the problem, then I think you have an idea which direction they're going into. So they do meet there, but we find different objectives combining there. So some have genuinely religious objectives, some others have far-right ultra-nationalist objectives, and then some others have a hyper-capitalist objective. So we see this coming together of different objectives, but around a common agreement that abortion is a problem as well as the gays. Okay. Next, on the strategic use of religions, this is something I've looked at in my recent report that Carolina has mentioned. One thing I found is that, at least in Europe, if we take a look at the main religions, so that's Catholicism, Orthodoxy, and traditionalist Protestantism. I haven't looked at the Jews or the Sikhs or the Hindus because they're not demographically important in Europe and they're not politically active. What we find is three trends. One is that the hierarchies of these religious institutions are all calling for greater social conservatism. Secondly, they're calling for greater political engagement of the faithful. And then a third trend that we're seeing is that far-right political parties are actively strategically targeting religious voters. So we have all of this happening. So my idea of involving religious people, it's nice, but I don't think it's going to work. It's about as successful as inviting vegetarians to a barbecue. You want to be inclusive, but it's just not going to work. Okay. And then finally, on the issue of the global gag rule, I wrote a separate little report about this, about the impact of the Trump administration. And some things I want to point out. The defunding is there. USAID is gone. It's not coming back. Okay. But that's not the end of it. After the loss of funding and the destruction of USAID, what we will see is a period of consolidation of anti-gender, anti-abortion US diplomacy. We're already seeing this where a US State Department report has condemned the UK buffer zones around abortion clinics. That came out just last week. Next phase we'll see, what I anticipate, is what's left of USAID funding what I call anti-gender services, okay? Crisis pregnancy centers, natural family planning, etc. That will likely be coming at some point once they get their act together. Whatever's left of USAID and whatever will go through the State Department. Now, what former recipients of USAID should be doing, they need to look to fund their own development programs when it comes to sexual and reproductive health and rights. The gap is too big for any other donors to fund, and a number of countries should have the domestic resources available. If I take Kenya, for example, why is Kenya in 2025 dependent on USAID when it has the fiscal space in order to fund its own family planning program, but wasn't? So I think we're going to need to look at these rather difficult questions in the near future. And then I'll just end on two things. One is that I don't think that abortion laws will be challenged directly in the near future, at least in Europe. Those will not be the primary targets. We have to take a look at the side doors that they will be trying to look into. And then finally, challenging abortion as such is no longer just about abortion. It's about a democratic and rule of law state. So I think that's something that we need to consider as well. Thank you.
Sure. I'll be quick. Oh, I thought that was like 5 minutes. I just wanted to re-echo Neil that obviously within the African context, particularly in South Africa, we've seen over the past couple of years, and we've done a little bit of mapping in South Africa, Kenya, as well as Ghana. We've seen the uptake of pregnancy crisis centers, and the fact that they exist in government institutions give them legitimacy, right? So people get in and gain those services, not knowing that obviously those are also funded, especially from the US side as well. And to the point around the counter mobilization arguments, what we obviously see quite a lot, and I didn't go in depth into that, but is the push or the narrative around traditional family values in the African context, and there have been popped up obviously conferences and meetings in various places, including Uganda, but also obviously African ambassadors in Addis are courted and trained in those spaces as well. So that is really also a space, and it speaks to, right, to to Africans and African values and African cultures and the way that we see relations as well. So as obviously, if you look at the differences, the messages have been very tailored to the specific context. And I think for us, even as we did the mapping, that was also something that we highlighted, especially in terms of strategies for pro-SRHR actors. It's also not to work in siloed, right? Really thinking about intersectional organizing, but that the anti-rights movement is really not just focused, obviously, as Neil said, not just on abortion, but obviously on various other issues as well. And to Carolina's point, I think, just on the concept of gendered autocratization, which did a keynote last year during the PhD course, and Syria and I are supposed to do a paper soon-ish. But I think what is interesting about that as well is just this idea, and then I think you mentioned it as well, both in terms of, when countries are transitioning into democracy, right, you will think that rights have been protected. But the Gambia is a good case study of how, for instance, we've seen backlash as it relates to female genital mutilation, right? So the Gambia last year was the first country that attempted to decriminalize FGM with the law that failed. It is the case is before the Supreme Court now, and just a couple of days ago, a 1-month-old baby died from FGM. So, and part of the conversation and the ripe space was because now we have a democracy, right? So I also think, as we think about autocratic dynamics as well, to think about that, but also connecting it to, Mindy's point earlier around the fact that majority of our laws, even those that are liberalized and expanded, still exist in our criminal law spaces, and so that also affects both access but also implementation as well. And just the fact that we also did borrow these laws obviously from former colonial rulers, and I think yesterday I was talking to Rachel about my new research project on gender and constitutions and exemption clauses, and just this idea that perhaps what we got, especially for former British colonies, was not the imposition of rights, but perhaps the suspension of rights. And so for folks in the global south, it's also to rethink about how we engage in these processes, as well as the question around reparations and so forth. But I'll stop for you guys. Thanks.
So maybe I would like to remind you to when this prohibition of abortion, so the ban of abortion started in Europe and then applied also in the colonies, of course. It was at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, when European states thought that a big population was a kind of force and reinforcing actually the imperial, also the colonial empires. So they wanted soldiers, they wanted workers. So I'm referring, of course, to Michel Foucault, biopolitics, so the notion of biopolitics. So it was a demographic issue, actually. And of course, rights of women at the time were really limited in Europe. And today, it's also a form of biopolitics in my mind. I mean, I think it's these demographic anxieties. So we have to push, for example, in Europe, white European people to reproduce, because we don't want to be overwhelmed by these migrants who are Muslim, who are black, or so there is this discourse against this, this big replacement theory, etc., but which is also motivated by economic reasons. So it was, I think, evoked yesterday in one of the panels, the idea that there is an economic rationale behind also the fact of emphasizing the natural family, go back to family. Women have to go back to their domestic role, etc. So to me, it's a mix of elements, but it's also very much related to the economic system and capitalism.
Wonderful questions, and I don't think I had anyone directed at me, but there are two that that really spoke to me. One was Namita's question about the strategic use of religion, which I think I interpret it differently from what was said, which is how can the arguments of religion be used for progressive actions. And I'm thinking of maybe in Europe it wouldn't work because of how the narrative has gone into secularization, and it's a secular society, and then people don't go to church, so the moral values. So it is the conservatives that have taken hold of religion. Whereas in other societies where religion is sort of, everyone takes it. This is why there's an opportunity for a narrative, a progressive narrative, based on the religion and the values. There are feminists in the Islamic world that are advocating for feminist values based on Islamic or on religion. So I think in those spaces it would work more. And I think that is where, you know, it doesn't work so much in Europe. And perhaps if people were more religious, I don't know, the discussion could be held between religious people and different interpretations of religion. And there has been a crisis, for example, with the Pope Francis, who had a backlash because I think he told favorably about respecting homosexual people.